When the Senate asked former FBI Director James Comey for the names of people he confided in about the president asking him, as head of the FBI, to lift the cloud of the Russia investigation, the list that James Comey gave the Senate was not a long one.
Who are those senior leaders at the FBI that you shared these conversations with?
As I said in response to Senator Feinstein's question, Deputy Director, my Chief of Staff, General Counsel, the Deputy Director's Chief Counsel, and then more often than not, the number 3 person at the FBI who's the Associate Deputy Director, and then quite often the head of the National Security Branch.
6 people in James Comey's inner circle, all but one of them are now gone from the FBI. The person he listed third, FBI General Counsel Jim Baker, he left the FBI in May of this year. Mr. Baker said at the time he was going to join the Brookings Institution, and he planned to write for their high-profile legal website on national security issues. Their website is called Lawfare. This week, in what I think is Jim Baker article number 6 for Lawfare, he has more or less blown up the internet. At least my personal social media feed is now useless for anything other than this story. This is the piece that he's just written. What the Watergate roadmap reveals about improper contact between the White House and the Justice Department. This is an in-depth historical piece about President Richard Nixon and the trouble he made for himself when he leaned on officials in his own Justice Department, both to try to influence the course of the Watergate investigation, but also specifically to get them to feed him information on the ongoing case. James Baker, ex-FBI General Counsel, now providing an impressive history lesson on how one of the articles of impeachment against Nixon was in part about him opening up a back channel of communication with a senior Justice Department official that was designed to inform him about the inner workings of the Watergate case. Joining us now for the interview is James Baker, former General Counsel of the FBI and co-author with Sarah Grant of this fascinating spotlight on this part of history. Mr. Baker, it's really nice to have you here. I know you don't do things like this often, if at all, so it's a real honor.
Well, first time ever.
Well, thank you. I promise it'll not be too painful, at least.
Okay, we'll see.
I want to talk to you about why you did this. I mean, you've written this piece. It has received a lot of attention, not only for, I think, the historical analogy that people are drawing to our current situation, but also because you wrote it. Can you just tell me what it is about this part of history that interests you so much?
Sure. Well, a couple things. When I didn't really know about the roadmap very much before. And when it was recently released by the district court in Washington, D.C., I looked at it. I'd heard about it, but I took a look at it, and I started reading it. And I saw all these references to Henry Petersen. And I had worked in the criminal division of the Department of Justice for many years and knew who Henry Petersen was, and he's a revered figure there. And so that sort of leapt off the page at me. I was like, what's all this about? So the roadmap itself is very sparse in terms of the information that it provides. And so but it cites two additional underlying documents that I started to dig into, like grand jury transcripts and some other documents, things like that. And so as I started to read those, I really, just was like, what in the world is this all about? The number of interactions that the President of the United States had directly with Mr. Petersen, who at the time, as you said earlier, was running. This is before the special prosecutor was appointed. Henry Petersen was in charge of effectively running the Watergate investigation, supervising it. And so there's all these contacts, there's all these interactions, there's all these discussions with the president, as you outlined. The president makes these comments about John Dean and, about Ehrlichman and Haldeman, I'm sorry, about how these are fine, upstanding guys, when Petersen and then Attorney General Kleindienst go in to see him in April of 1973 and tell him, like, look, we've got a problem. We're really concerned about these guys, and we think you should fire them. And the president had a reaction that was kind of surprising to me. But as I dug into it more, it was the volume of it was the number of interactions, the nature, the scope that really surprised me. So I was just surprised by it and intrigued. And then I guess the other thing is, as you said earlier, this was something that I was unaware of before myself, and having worked in the Justice Department for many years. And I thought it was something that might be useful to folks still in the Justice Department to be aware of, to have some knowledge about. One of the things that I struggled with all the time, well, not all the time, but frequently, was having to confront novel, complicated, challenging problems that there was no book to go to look up an answer. Like, how did people deal with with this before. What are the guidelines? What are the cases? Oftentimes, there were no guidelines or cases or other things that you could go to. And so whenever there is something that you can look at, something to inform decision makers about what the best way to go is, it seems like it should be useful and might be useful. And so I thought it would be helpful to have both folks in the government have access to this information, and then obviously more broadly the American people. I think it's, we, as many people have said, if we don't learn from history, we're condemned to repeat it. And so this was a piece of history that I personally didn't know about. I thought it was intriguing and interesting. And as you mentioned, Sarah Grant and I wrote this up and put it out there.
In terms of looking back at this and sort of seeing how people have dealt with this before, what might be the relevant precedent or the lessons of history here, obviously there's a lesson of history here in terms of Nixon. Nixon gets caught for doing this. As you spell out in your piece, one of the articles of impeachment is based in part on him having improper contact with the Justice Department about this ongoing investigation. I wonder, though, if it was also improper from the perspective of the Justice Department for Henry Peterson, for the senior Justice Department official, to be talking to the president. Certainly, Peterson at the time was pilloried for having done that. It didn't necessarily look good that he'd been having all these conversations with the president about that investigation. How do you view that, looking back on it?
I guess a couple of things. One is, I'm not a Watergate historian. Sarah's not a Watergate historian, so we're not capable of really making a full accounting of everything that happened here. So that's number one. I mean, look, it does look alarming when you look at this of the interactions. But Mr. Peterson did not know all the facts that we know now, right? In terms of what the president knew and what the president was aware of and what the president was trying to achieve through his interactions with him. If you take Mr. Peterson's statements at face value, and he was a man of high integrity from everything that I understand, so I take those at face value. He said, look, I was the Assistant Attorney General in the Criminal Division. I felt I had an obligation to inform the president of what was going on, and I think implicit in that is that he didn't know the level of the president's involvement in these types of activities. He didn't know what was in the president's mind at the time. He didn't know how the president was trying to misuse his interactions with Henry Peterson. So I think you have to sort of give him the benefit of the doubt. At the same time, though, as you highlighted from the piece, these types of interactions are dangerous for everybody. They're dangerous for the president because they can lead down this road that we saw happen with President Nixon. And they're also potentially dangerous for the Department of Justice, for the integrity of the investigation. A couple different, well, at least one time, significantly, President Nixon specifically told Henry Peterson, do not investigate anything having to do with the Daniel Ellsberg, with the break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist office, when Peterson told Nixon that Dean had told the prosecutors about that. President Nixon said, no, stay away from that. Do not investigate that. That's outside your mandate. So he actually was able to constrict significantly a part of the investigation. So it's dangerous for all sides involved, which is why over the years there's been a history of, since Watergate, since these things came to light, of the department and the White House being very cautious about what the nature and scope of the interactions between the two organizations is and how that's regulated, especially when you've got an investigation going on that touches the White House.
As a regulated matter, and I'm not asking you to comment on the Trump administration specifically, I know that you're constrained from being able to do that here. But as a matter of that you say is regulated now in terms of contacts between the White House and the Justice Department, if there were violations on that, if there were somebody at a high level in the Justice Department who was having secret communications with the White House about an investigation that involved the White House, that would be against Justice Department rules. That's the sort of thing that you would expect the Inspector General to look into if there were credible allegations of that.
Just speaking hypothetically and generically, yeah, I mean, potentially, yes, the IG could look at that. The IG has a broad scope of authority and certainly could look at that.
James Baker, former general counsel of the FBI, again, a man who does not do interviews like this. I really appreciate you making time to be here and talking to us about this piece. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right. I have some more questions. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.